Picture this. It's a Tuesday. Not a particularly bad Tuesday. Nothing dramatic has happened. No surprise bills, no emergency. Just a regular Tuesday. And yet you're lying in bed at 11:30 at night, running numbers in your head, calculating, recalculating, mentally moving money from one account to another like some kind of sad mental chess game where nobody wins. You're not even sure what you're calculating anymore. You just can't stop. The rent is fine, the groceries are covered, but the anxiety? The anxiety doesn't get the memo. And maybe the worst part is that intellectually, you fully know that you're okay, that this specific Tuesday is not a crisis. And yet, something in your chest still feels tight, like there's a low hum of financial dread that just never fully turns off. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know it's not just you. And I want you to know there's actually a really interesting reason why your brain does this, why the stress doesn't always match the situation, why the worry can feel almost compulsive, and honestly, why simply earning more money doesn't automatically fix it. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to reach a point where money stress just quiets down, while others keep grinding through the same anxious patterns no matter how much their income grows. That question has genuinely kept me up at night, which, yes, is a little ironic given what we're talking about today. What I want to walk you through is something a lot of people think they understand but actually don't. This idea of an income threshold, specifically around the $100,000 mark, and what that number actually represents psychologically, practically, and emotionally. Because the answer is both more complicated and more hopeful than you'd probably expect. Stick with me here. So let's start at the beginning. Most of us grow up with this idea baked in, this almost unconscious belief that money stress is fundamentally a math problem. Like, you don't have enough, so you stress. You get more, the stress goes away. It's this beautiful, simple equation that would be incredibly convenient if it were actually true. And look, to some extent, it is true. There's a massive difference between struggling to pay rent and not struggling to pay rent. That's real. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that money problems aren't sometimes just money problems. But here's where it gets interesting. Study after study, and I mean genuinely rigorous research, has found that above a certain income level, additional money stops moving the needle on day-to-day emotional well-being in the way you'd expect. You've probably heard a version of this. The famous Princeton study from around 2010 suggested that emotional well-being kind of plateaued around $75,000 a year. More recent research from Matthew Killingsworth at Wharton pushed that number higher, suggesting well-being keeps rising well past that point for many people. There's actually an ongoing debate in the research community about where exactly the line is and whether it even works the same way for everyone. But here's the thing that I think both camps miss when this study gets talked about online. People focus on the number. They debate whether it's $75K or $100K or $200K, and they completely skip over the more interesting question. Why does money stop helping at some point? And what is actually happening in the mind when that shift occurs? Because the answer has almost nothing to do with the number itself. Think about someone you know, maybe yourself, who got a raise, felt amazing for a month, and then kind of adjusted, and then was right back to stressing about money, just about slightly different things. New income level, same emotional state. That phenomenon has a name. It's called the hedonic treadmill, and it is absolutely ruthless. Your brain is remarkable at normalizing. Whatever your new baseline is, it becomes the floor, not the ceiling. And then you start worrying about protecting that floor. So the first thing to understand is this. Earning more money doesn't automatically reduce money stress. What reduces money stress is a specific shift in how your financial life is structured, and that shift can happen at a lot of different income levels, but it tends to become genuinely achievable around the $100,000 mark for most people in most American cities. Note the word achievable, not automatic. Achievable. To understand why 100K matters, you first have to understand what life feels like below it. And I don't mean this in a condescending way. I mean it in a neurological, psychological, very real human way. When your income is tight, when you're covering your bills, maybe even comfortable month to month, but there is genuinely no buffer, your nervous system lives in a state of low-grade alert. Researchers sometimes call this scarcity mindset, and the work of economists Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir on this is genuinely fascinating. What they found is that when people are operating under conditions of financial scarcity, it actually reduces cognitive bandwidth, like measurably. You have less mental space for long-term thinking, for creativity, for complex problem solving, because your brain is quietly devoted to managing the scarcity. It's not a character flaw. It's how human brains work under resource pressure. Here's a metaphor I keep coming back to. You know when you have too many tabs open on your computer and everything starts running slow? That's basically what financial stress does to your prefrontal cortex. The rational, long-term planning part of your brain is still there. It's just running a background process called what if something goes wrong basically 24 hours a day, and it is eating up RAM. And the cruel thing about this is that it makes it harder to get out. When you're in scarcity, you're more likely to make short-term decisions that aren't great for long-term wealth building, not because you're bad with money, because your brain is genuinely overloaded. The payday loan industry exists partly because of this phenomenon. When you need money now and your bandwidth is consumed by immediate crisis, the 400% interest rate feels less real than the immediate relief. This is not stupidity, this is cognitive science. So below a certain threshold, and this is different for everyone depending on where they live, what their expenses look like, what their family situation is, below that threshold, you're not just dealing with a financial problem, you're dealing with a brain that is partially offline because it's managing threat. Here's where it starts to get genuinely hopeful. Because the $100,000 figure in most conversations gets treated like a magic number. Hit 6 figures, life gets better. Roll credits. And that's such a frustrating oversimplification because it misses what the number actually represents. What $100,000 in annual income represents, again, depending on location and circumstances, is the realistic possibility of building what I'd call meaningful margin. And margin is the actual variable that reduces financial stress, not income. Margin. Margin is the difference between what you make and what you need. It's the gap between your obligations and your resources. And here's why it matters so much psychologically. When you have real margin, your brain gets to stop running the scarcity background program. Not because you're rich, because the immediate threat is no longer immediately threatening. Think about it this way. If you make $60,000 a year in a city where a comfortable life costs you $58,000 a year, you're fine on paper. You're making decent money. But your margin is basically $2,000. That is nothing. One car repair, one medical bill, 1 month where something goes sideways, and you're borrowing from the next month, or putting it on a card, or frantically moving money around. The anxiety that produces is completely disproportionate to your actual income, because your brain knows the buffer is thin. Now flip it. Someone making $100,000 with $70,000 in actual living expenses has $30,000 of margin to work with every year. That's roughly $2,500 a month that isn't already spoken for. That margin is enough to build an emergency fund that actually feels like an emergency fund. It's enough to start investing in a way that starts to feel real. It's enough that when the car breaks down, it's an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. And the emotional shift that comes from that, from catastrophe to inconvenience, is enormous. It's not the $100,000. It's what the $100,000 makes possible for the first time for a lot of people. That gap, that room to breathe. The practical takeaway here is actually really useful regardless of where you are right now. The goal isn't a specific income number. The goal is margin. And you can work on margin from literally any income level by looking at both sides of the equation, what comes in and what goes out. I know that sounds obvious, but most people focus exclusively on the income side, which is only half the picture. Let's talk about something that I think is wildly underappreciated: the emergency fund. Not as a financial instrument, most people know they should have one, but as a psychological object, because the way an emergency fund interacts with your brain is genuinely strange and powerful. Here's what I mean. A fully funded emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of expenses sitting in a savings account, is not primarily useful because you'll need to use it. Statistically, most people with a solid emergency fund don't deplete it very often. They dip into it occasionally, sure, but a total wipeout is relatively rare. The psychological value of an emergency fund isn't in the using, it's in the knowing. There's a specific quality of calm that comes from knowing, not hoping, not planning, but actually knowing that if everything fell apart tomorrow, you have a runway, you have time, you have options. And I think underestimating this is one of the biggest mistakes people make in personal finance conversations. We talk about emergency funds like they're a checkbox. Build 3 months of expenses, check, moving on. But the emotional effect of that fund is cumulative and profound. I talked to someone once, this was a few years ago, she had just crossed the point where she had a full 6 months saved, and she described it as feeling like she finally exhaled. That's the word she used. She said it felt like a breath she'd been holding for literally a decade. Not because her life got easier, but because the catastrophe scenario, the absolute worst case, was now survivable in a way it genuinely wasn't before. That exhale, that is what money stress resolution actually feels like. It's not excitement or celebration. It's quietness. It's the low hum turning off. And here's the thing, you don't need to make $100,000 to build that emergency fund, but making $100,000 or creating sufficient margin at whatever income you're at makes it dramatically more realistic to actually build it within a reasonable timeline without it feeling like you're starving yourself financially to get there. Okay, I want to slow down here because this is where it gets genuinely complicated. Because even when people cross the 100,000 threshold, even when they build margin, even when they have the emergency fund, a surprising number of them still feel anxious, still feel like it's not quite enough, still feel like they're one bad decision away from it all collapsing. And if you've experienced that, I really want to be honest with you about it. That's not always a financial problem anymore. At some point, for a lot of people, it becomes a psychological one. There's a concept in financial therapy, yes, financial therapy is a real and genuinely useful field, called financial anxiety disorder, or sometimes just chronic money worry. And what makes it distinct from regular money stress is that it persists even when the objective financial situation improves. The numbers change, but the feeling doesn't. The emergency fund gets built, but doesn't feel like enough. The income goes up, but the catastrophizing doesn't slow down. This often has roots that go back way further than your current bank balance. If you grew up in a household where money was always tight, always scary, always a source of conflict, your nervous system learned that money equals threat, and nervous systems don't just update their programming because your income crossed a threshold. They need more than that. I want to be careful here because I'm not a therapist and I don't want to oversimplify what can be a genuinely complex psychological issue, but I do think it's worth naming because so many financial conversations treat money stress as a purely mathematical problem with a purely mathematical solution. And for a lot of people, honestly, I'd say for most people who grew up with any financial instability, there's a layer underneath that needs a different kind of attention. What helps? A few things that come up consistently. One is tracking your net worth over time, not obsessively, but monthly, because it creates a visual record of progress that your anxious brain can actually see. Anxiety thrives in uncertainty. Specific data is anxiety's enemy. Another thing that helps is what some therapists call the worst-case rehearsal, actually walking through what would happen if everything fell apart, step by step, and realizing that even in the worst case, there are more options than the panic suggests. And for some people, actual therapy with someone who specializes in financial anxiety is genuinely transformative in a way that no budgeting app ever will be. The income threshold matters,
but the psychological work matters too. And honestly, you can start the psychological work right now, regardless of where your income is.
Let me be real with you about something that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations. A lot of people cross $100,000 and feel no different, not because the threshold doesn't matter, but because of something that eats the margin before it can do its job. Lifestyle inflation, the quiet, comfortable, almost invisible process by which your expenses grow to match and sometimes exceed your income growth. It makes total sense why it happens. You worked hard to get here. You deserve the nicer apartment, the better car, the restaurants you used to only go to for special occasions becoming regular Thursday nights. None of these things are bad in isolation, but if your spending rises in lockstep with your income, you end up with the same margin you had before, same buffer, same thin gap between what comes in and what goes out, just at a higher altitude. I've seen this described as making six figures and feeling broke, and the internet is full of people who are genuinely baffled that $120,000 a year doesn't feel like a lot of money. And look, cost of living in major cities is genuinely brutal right now, so I don't want to dismiss that, but also a significant portion of that phenomenon is lifestyle inflation operating exactly the way it always does. The fix isn't deprivation, it's intentionality. There's actually a principle sometimes called paying yourself first. Before lifestyle inflation gets a chance to spend the margin, you automatically redirect a portion of every income increase toward building wealth. You take, say, half of every raise and funnel it into savings and investments before it ever touches your spending accounts. That way, you still get a lifestyle upgrade because the other half of the raise does go toward living better, but you also capture some of the wealth-building potential that otherwise just disappears into nicer stuff. This is honestly one of the most mechanically important habits in personal finance, and it sounds so simple that people underestimate it. But the compounding effect of consistently doing this across your career is the difference between reaching your 60s with wealth and reaching your 60s wondering what happened to all the money you earned. So, after all of this, after talking about margins and emergency funds and psychological roots and lifestyle inflation, when does the shift actually happen? When does money stress actually genuinely quiet down? Honestly, I think it happens at different times for different people, and it almost never happens all at once. It's not a single moment, it's a series of smaller ones. It's the first time your car breaks down and you just fix it. No drama, no credit card panic, no lying awake calculating. You just call the mechanic and you fix it. It's the first time a friend invites you somewhere expensive and you can say yes without doing math in your head first. It's the first time you check your savings account and feel something that isn't dread, something quieter, something that might tentatively be described as okay. It's the first time the low hum goes silent and you notice the silence. These moments don't require $100,000 a year, but they do require margin. They require a buffer. They require some version of financial stability that moves you from scarcity to sufficiency. And for most people, in most circumstances, that kind of sufficiency becomes genuinely achievable in the six-figure range, which is why the number has the cultural resonance it does. It's not magic, it's just where sufficiency usually starts to become structurally possible. What I'd invite you to think about, wherever you are right now, is not how do I hit 100K as though the number itself is the destination, but rather what does margin look like in my specific life? What is my personal sufficiency threshold? What would it take for me to have enough buffer that the catastrophe scenarios stop feeling immediate? Because that question has an answer. Maybe it requires more income. Maybe it requires reducing expenses. Maybe it requires both. Maybe it requires addressing the psychological piece that keeps you anxious even when the numbers are fine.
but it has an answer, and that answer is worth pursuing with everything you've got, because the life on the other side of that threshold, the quieter, lower hum life, is genuinely different in ways that are hard to overstate. I want to end with something that I find genuinely moving, which is a little unexpected for a finance video, but bear with me. There is a version of your financial life where money is just a thing you manage, not a thing that manages you, where you make decisions about it from a place of clarity rather than fear, where the last thought you have before you fall asleep on a random Tuesday is not a recalculation, not a what-if spiral, not a mental ledger of everything that could go wrong, where you just fall asleep. That version of your life is not reserved for millionaires. It is not reserved for people who grew up wealthy, or who never made mistakes, or who somehow figured it all out at 25. It is available to most people who reach a sufficiency threshold, who build real margin, who protect that margin from lifestyle inflation, who do the psychological work of actually believing they're okay, who build a buffer and then actually let it buffer them. The $100,000 threshold is real, but it's not the whole story. The whole story is about building a relationship with money that is characterized by agency rather than anxiety, and you can start building that relationship today at whatever income you're at by asking better questions about margin, about what your specific version of enough actually looks like. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. 1. Money stress is real and neurologically grounded, not a personal weakness. 2. Income alone doesn't fix it. Margin and buffer do. 3. Lifestyle inflation is the sneaky thing that eats the threshold alive, so be intentional about capturing your income growth before it spends itself. 4. The psychological dimension of money stress is real and separate from the math, and it deserves its own kind of attention. And 5. The quiet on the other side of all this work is real. It exists, people reach it, and it is absolutely worth building toward. Thank you so much for spending time with me today on something that honestly, deeply matters. If this resonated with you, if that Tuesday night scenario at the beginning hit a little too close to home, I hope something in here gave you a clearer picture of what you're actually working toward and why it's worth the work.